Hopefully you've seen my video on understanding distortion, where we saw how different amplifiers change the frequency content of our signal using my Star Trek looking gear you see here. But today I'm going to show you one of my most valuable pieces of test gear. It's certainly not the high-tech kind like these rock stars, but it is one of my most essential and most used pieces of test equipment. This is my Sencore TC142 Tube Tester, and this is Tools of the Trade, where I show you the world of an electronic technician and the test equipment I use to service music gear. Hopefully show you some of the things that I've learned over the years. So welcome, friends. On a serious note, if you don't know what you're doing, please don't work in a high voltage environment. It can only end badly. The job of the tube tester is self-explanatory. It tests your tubes, and there's many old and several modern versions to choose from. Like everything these days, there's been much discussion and disagreement on what's best. And unsurprisingly, there's tester fanboys out there, and I'm going to do my best not to anger them. So right off the bat, I'll say this. The Sencore is not the best or most precise tester out there. It uses an emission testing circuit. It's considered not as accurate as the mutual conductance methods used by Hickox and some other manufacturers. But it is faster to set up and preferable to me in a service setting. If you're in the business of amp manufacturing or need to closely match your output tubes in bulk, well then a mutual conductance tester might be preferable to you. But as for me, my priorities lie in a speedy diagnosis of my customers' issues, and the Sencore really excels at discovering almost all of the tube issues I encounter. My opinions on the value of tube matching I'll discuss at length in another video, but for now it's not important. I plan on discussing tubes and how they fail at length in their own video, but briefly the Sencore performs several important tests on the tubes that allow us to critically assess it. Primarily, it'll measure the general strength of the tube. How much miles is left, meat on the bone, whatever you want to do it. New tubes will rate high, worn out tubes will rate bad on the scale you see down there. But an important thing, maybe a critical thing, is really not just where the needle ends up in the zone there, the good or bad, but how it does it. When we test the tubes, I'll show you the speed, and just the response it does is just as critical as, like I say, whether the tester tells you good or bad. Number two, it'll detect any short circuits in the tube. Those will probably show up in your amp by blowing a fuse, but this will do it also. The Sencore detects grid leakage. We'll discuss that when we're testing tubes. I see that a lot. This is very good at that. It also allows you to get a visual on the heater going. You see the tube glowing, the heater works and everything. It's not so good at detecting microphonics. I'll thump on the tube and circuit there, see if the needle moves, but that's better done in amp. And it doesn't detect tube rattle and output tubes. You really have to be, in the amp to detect that. Using a tube tester is pretty easy. What you do is you take your tube and you'll look up the number in the book that comes with the tester. Here it's conveniently on the lid, and I show you there. I'm familiar with all the setup codes from doing it from so many years, but if you're new to it, you have to look it up, and it'll tell you where to set all the dials and what socket you use to test the tube in. First test we're going to do today is the easiest one. We're going to do a rectifier tube, a 5AR4, from one of my amplifiers here. I only have a good example, not a bad one, but I'm going to do the setup and we'll see how to test that. Well, the tube tester is all set up for a 5AR4 and it's in the socket there. Testing rectifier tubes is really the easiest of all of them because I'm going to tell you a secret. If it shows up as good on the scale there, it's good. A rectifier doesn't really have too much on it other than supplying some DC for everything. And if the tube tester says it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. Other tubes you have to be more critical of how the needle shows it's good and all of that, but this is not the case. And also a very valuable tip here, if you're spending a lot of money on NOS rectifier tubes, well, don't do it. I buy the very cheapest ones. The only quality you have to look at is just how durable they are, how long they're going to last, because they make no effect on your tone. You know, people can argue with me, but my test equipment will always prove you wrong. So let's test a rectifier tube. Rectifier tubes, like most of the preamp tubes you'll see in guitar amps, have two elements we need to test in them. We'll select them on the D knob down below there between D and F. So first up, let's test the emissions on the D side. See the needle rise in a steady manner into the good, absolutely good. Next up we test grid leakage. We see nothing, shorts, nothing. We turn it off, we change this over to the F unit. Back to emissions, we see good. No grid leakage, no short circuits, off. A perfect rectifier tube. Like I said, if these things work, they can go in the amp. When they fail, they just die. So this is the easiest tube to test. I've got a 12AX7 set up here in socket 3 for you. We'll test it out. I know it's good, it came from my amp. But preamp tubes like this, they fail in two main ways. When they get really old, they're prone to being microphonic, which means that you can bang on them with your finger and hear it come through the amp. And at the same time, you know, what you don't see is they'll amplify some frequencies other than others, you know, because of that quality, which makes them bad for music gear, really. So this isn't so great at detecting those. I bang on them with my finger on the emissions test and see if the needle jumps, but that's usually a pretty gross example. I test those in the amplifier by just banging my finger on them. But let's test this one here. We'll turn the emissions on. These aren't as simple as rectifier tubes. It's important that when we see the needle rise, you notice it started out and it gained velocity and it ended up in the good. Where it ends up doesn't really matter. They're going to vary when they're manufactured, but just you notice how it was speedy there. If it's really slow and just crawling, it doesn't matter if it ends up in the good. If it's crawling up into there, the response of that tube is just going to be crappy. Throw it out. That's the response of a good tube. So grid leakage, which can certainly be an issue in preamp tubes, not as much as power tubes. No shorts. We'll go to the G side, the other triode. Once again, you see how fast that needle snaps. That is the killer groove tube. Zero grid leakage, no shorts. All this is indicative of a good tube. If you don't see these kind of results, it's likely no good. Lastly, we're going to test a power tube. This is an EL84 out of one of my amps. I know it's good, so I'll show you the characteristics of a good tube. I also have a bad EL84 that I'll show you after this. Power tubes, there's just one unit in there. There's only one unit to test, not like 12A series we see. So power tubes usually wear out by two methods. They just generally go bad, as you see on the scale. And like I showed you, we want to see the needle kind of rise in a quick manner and not be sluggish. That's important on these. They're also really prone to grid leakage, which the Sencore really excels at picking out, and why I love it. Let's take a look. Let's turn the emissions on. Watch the needle. rising in a steady manner into the good, exactly what we expect to see. Turn on the grid leakage, there's nothing. EL84s get beat up, so I see grid leakage in these all the time when they've been used for any period of time. Nothing on the short tests. That's a good output tube. Now finally everybody, I'm going to show you a bad tube. This is an EL84 I just pulled out of my amp that you might have seen on my distortion video. EL84s get beat up pretty damn bad. They're the hardest working tubes in the biz. So try testing normally the emissions on this and see what happens. Notice the tube is moving up. You know, it's not as fast as the other one I showed you that was like new and everything, but if I saw that I would say, you know, that's got a little wear on it, but that's still, you know, a good tube. But notice I turned it on grid leakage and boy, it's certainly up there in the bad. That's because inside the tube there's current flowing where we don't want it to flow. And how that may affect your sound and tone can range from hardly at all to terrible. But no matter, you know, no short circuit or anything, this tube tests bad. Other than that, it will work in circuit, it'll certainly get loud and everything. But no doubt this tube is shot and it's got to be replaced. In closing, do you need a tube tester? For the average tube amp user, no. Just buy decent tubes and substitute a good one when you suspect one is bad. For the amp tech working on music gear, this piece of test equipment is absolutely critical. It's a 5 out of 5. On my scale, so go get one now. I'm Amp Tech Ron, and I hope to see you soon on my next Tools of the Trade.